Good afternoon and welcome to the first lecture of the 2014 Food for Thought Luncheon Lecture Series. I'm Mary Kay Cooper, Senior Director of Alumni Relations here at the university. This series is sponsored by the San Antonio Alumni Chapter and coordinated by the Alumni Office. The series is designed to spotlight Trinity's outstanding employees. Before we get to today's talk, I would like to tell you about an upcoming event. Trinity's Distinguished Scientist Lecture Series presents Sir Harold Kroto on March 5th in Laurie Auditorium from 7:30 to 9:30 p.m. Kroto is the English chemist who shared the 1996 Nobel Prize in Chemistry with Robert Curl and Richard Smalley. Kroto is the Francis Epps Professor of Chemistry at the Florida State University, which he joined in 2004. Prior to that, he spent a large part of his career at the University of Sussex, where he now holds an emeritus professorship. The lecture is free and open to the public. We're pleased to have several special Trinity people with us today, and I want you to be able to recognize a few of them. Two of them are Vice President for Faculty and Student Affairs, Michael Fischer, and his wife, Kim Fischer. You'll be hearing a lot more about Dr. Fischer momentarily. This program is being live streamed and recorded so that people all over the world can view it or listen to it now and later. So during the question and answer period, please come to the microphone to ask your question. In addition, those of you in our virtual audience today are welcome to tweet or email your questions for the Q&A. Those instructions can be found on your screen. And I ask your forgiveness now. I will be on my phone during the presentation monitoring those accounts. Our speaker will be introduced by Carol Covert, class of 1984. She is a director and the Recruitment Network Chair on the San Antonio Alumni Chapter Board. Take it away.
Hi, Michael Fischer, Dr. Michael Fischer, is in his 14th year as Vice President for Faculty and Student Affairs here at Trinity. He oversees all the academic programs at Trinity, along with Student Affairs, Athletics, Trinity University Press, which publishes great books, international programs, and the registrar. He does an awful lot here. He teaches a seminar for first-year students as part of HUMA, which features readings from classical Greece and Rome. He majors in English and graduated magna cum laude from Princeton University and received his master's and doctorate in English from Northwestern University. He publishes widely on literature and literary criticism and regularly reviews new novels for the San Antonio Express News. His topic today is defending compromise.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for coming. I'm a huge fan of these Food for Thought talks, and I know how good they've been, and I hope I can meet the high standard that everybody has set. And again, I appreciate your coming, especially on such a cold, surprisingly cold day. I think winter is back, isn't it? Well, my topic is defending compromise, and the basic points that I'm going to be making are that it is very difficult to defend compromise in America today, and it's also very important. And to illustrate what I mean, I want to start with a recent attempt to defend compromise that got me started thinking about this subject. This is a column that was published in the winter 2013 issue of Emory magazine by that university's president, Dr. James Wagner. Now, Emory magazine is a fairly typical university magazine whose readership is primarily alumni, parents, board members, and other friends of the university. Well, in that article, Dr. Wagner praises compromise as essential to the American political system. He goes on to say that he is defending compromise because political polarization is jeopardizing the ability of national leaders to deal with urgent issues. As a citizen, he's advocating compromise as a way past legislative paralysis. As a university president, he wants to remind his readers that compromise is alive and well at their university, Emory. What Dr. Wagner calls the messy inefficiency of university life, and by that he means our tendency in universities to want to reach consensus before we make any decision, no matter how long that process takes. What he calls the messy inefficiency of university life, he says, results from welcoming different points of view and working through them to decisions that benefit the university as a whole. He concludes that even as Emory, like other universities, faces limited resources and competing visions of what should be done with them, he concludes, I am grateful that we have at our disposal the rich tools of compromise that help us achieve our most noble goals. He then cites as a historical example of compromise the agreement at the 1787 Constitutional Convention that determined how many representatives would be assigned to each state in the newly created House of Representatives. And as you may remember from your American history classes, the number of representatives was to be determined by the population of each state. But a dispute arose at the convention as a result of slavery. Southern delegates wanted to count the whole slave population, whereas Northern delegates did not want to count slaves at all. And so to resolve this disagreement, as Dr. Wagner notes, the two sides set aside their original positions and settled on something in between. 3/5 of the slave population would count, and that compromise enabled the new Constitution and country to take shape. Now, the president's column in an alumni magazine is not usually associated with controversy. But Dr. Wagner's column quickly made national news. Readers were furious that he had cited what historians called the 3/5 compromise. He had cited this compromise without deploring the slavery that the compromise kept intact and even inscribed in the inaugural United States Constitution. The outrage of these readers triggered this apology from Dr. Wagner that now precedes his column on the website, or the magazine website. Here's what he says. A number of people have raised questions regarding part of my essay in the most recent issue of Emory magazine. Certainly, I do not consider slavery anything but heinous, repulsive, repugnant, and inhuman. I should have stated that more clearly in my essay. I am sorry for the hurt caused by not communicating more clearly my own beliefs to those hurt or confused by my clumsiness and insensitivity. Please forgive me. Most readers, myself included, accepted this apology, but the damage had been done, if not to Emory's reputation as a university, it's an excellent university, or to Dr. Wagner's presidency. The damage had been done to his defense of compromise, which got lost in the noise. Now, I think that Dr. Wagner's defense of compromise and the furor that it touched off say much about attitudes toward compromise in contemporary America. Like Dr. Wagner, many observers feel that unprecedented polarization is hurting the country. Pick any issue, and chances are that the national legislative stalemate is making it worse. So with political gridlock identified as the problem, many people put forth compromise as the remedy. But when a specific compromise is proposed, even a compromise less controversial than the so-called 3/5 compromise, when a specific compromise is proposed, even the most ardent proponents of compromise attack it. The failure to arrive at an agreement then produces additional opportunities for the two sides to blame one another. Finally, when at all odds an often last-minute compromise is achieved, it occasions disappointment, not celebration. So that in our common conversation, a compromise has come to suggest not every faction benefiting, but all sides feeling shortchanged and more determined than ever to defeat their adversaries next time instead of giving in to them. So in the work that I'm doing, I'm trying to explore why compromise functions as what one philosopher calls a boo-hurrah concept. Something we cheer in theory, hurrah, as evidence of cooperation and generosity, but attack in practice, boo, as a sign of selling out and spinelessness. I'm glad you appreciate that because it took me about a week to figure out what he meant by boo hurrah. I thought it was initially one word, and for me to, I'm glad I got that fixed. So what I'm looking at, and I'm in exploring this, I'm looking at the role that compromise plays in resolving or fail to resolve a wide range of disputes, from international employment and legislative conflicts to business and aesthetic disagreements. I'm especially interested in aesthetic disputes because I think that in the consideration of compromise, as in so many areas of our lives, literature and the other arts are underutilized resources. I'll return to that in a minute. By an aesthetic dispute, I mean the argument that can break out when two people disagree in their judgment of a work of art. When, for example, I sleep through a movie that moves my wife to tears. My family and I have an ongoing debate about what it means when I fall asleep in a movie. They think my falling asleep disqualifies me from making a critical judgment. After all, I've fallen asleep. I think that my falling asleep is a critical judgment because I don't fall asleep when I'm watching a Spurs playoff game, which has all the drama and excitement missing in the movie that made me fall asleep. Now, in our family, and maybe in some others, these debates are resolved not by compromise, but by capitulation on my part. I give in. I accept defeat, and that's how the dispute goes away. Now, I'm exaggerating what happens when we debate movies in our family, but two important points about compromise are in this little family drama that I've been sharing with you. The first point is that it's important to understand why capitulation is not compromise. A compromise is freely entered into. It's not the result of extortion, blackmail, or force. When someone refuses to deal with a kidnapper demanding ransom, that person is not refusing to negotiate, but refusing to be bullied. And there's a big difference. People who value compromise, and I'm one of them, people who value compromise are affirming the democratic ideal of individuals resolving their differences peacefully through the give and take of free discussion, not through force of any kind. A coerced agreement is not a compromise, but a begrudging concession, a resented pause in a conflict that one day is sure to resume. A second important point about our movie debate is that being in a long-term relationship that we care about adds to our incentive to compromise. In such a relationship, I trust that the concession I make will be reciprocated, that I won't be taken advantage of, that maintaining the relationship matters because over time I benefit from the differences the relationship brings to my life. The partners in such a relationship often refrain from driving as hard a bargain as they can out of respect for one another and what they have achieved together. They aim not at humiliating one another or paying back grievances, but finding ways to continue as partners together. Empathy plays a key role in such a relationship, as each side acknowledges the legitimate needs and honorable motives of the other. Sharing the world with someone who thinks differently becomes an opportunity for growth, not an occasion for resentment or counterattack. These are very important points in my understanding of compromise. Being in a relationship that you value, and that can be a personal relationship or a workplace collaboration. Being in a relationship that you value, empathizing with the other person, and being willing to compromise, all these reinforce one another. If you weaken one of those, you jeopardize the other two. I'll return to these larger points in my conclusion, but first let me look more closely at another kind of dispute, legislative disagreements, and more specifically, why members of Congress find it so hard to compromise, even as they deplore the gridlock that results from their own actions. And here I've been helped by a recent book by Amy Gutman and Dennis Thompson called The Spirit of Compromise: Why Governing Demands It and Campaigning Undermines It. Like Dr. Wagner, like me, Dr. Gutman and Dr. Thompson emphasized the necessity of compromise in democracies, which in their view, as well as in mine, should value disagreement and welcome different points of view. They point out that even if a landslide election were to bring the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the White House under the control of one party, the need for compromise would persist because of inevitable differences within that party. In a democracy, even the most powerful national leader, and the usual examples I often hear are an arm-twisting Lyndon Baines Johnson, a savvy Abraham Lincoln, at least in the Spielberg movie, a persuasive Ronald Reagan. Even the most powerful national leader still has to find receptive partners from the other side and meet them halfway, even if that other side is within that person's own party. There is always another point of view in a democracy, and there always should be. Compromise will thus always be essential, will always be what Dr. Gottman and Dr. Thompson called the artistry of democracy. There is no escape from compromise. It's an indispensable precondition for achieving legislative change from this point of view. We can't ever have an important piece of legislation that didn't involve compromise at some level. Put this more negatively, without trade-offs, concessions, and mutual accommodation to bridge divergent perspectives, legislating degenerates into grandstanding gestures and ineffectual rhetoric. So although compromise will always be essential to getting things done, Dr. Gutman and Dr. Thompson show that specific legislative compromises are always vulnerable to second guessing and disappointment. For one thing, in practice, compromises are what they call path dependent, meaning that how a compromise is reached affects how it is valued. And the process of arriving at an agreement will never be perfectly transparent, inclusive, and paced. Every perceived compromise then is vulnerable to second guessing on the grounds that there was some procedural flaw that came into play and tainted it. Another reason why compromise is vulnerable to second guessing is that in our polarized contemporary American politics, win-win solutions are rare, and it's difficult to find common ground, which means that making concessions is much more common than finding things that people can agree on. So that the best that you can achieve in a compromise, and it's important to note that this can still be better than what the compromise is improving on, the best that can be achieved in a compromise will resemble a grab bag of expedient half measures instead of a coherent resolution. One final point, adding to the vulnerable of compromises after the fact, second guessing, is that in the process of engaging in a compromise, the participants really never know what's going to happen or what they should do. In other words, parties to a compromise can never know if they should have tried a different tactic at the outset or held out for more at the end. They were always haunted by the feeling that the outcome would have been better if they had been more forceful or if their adversaries had been more cooperative. Now, here's the key point. According to Dr. Thompson and Dr. Gutman, American political campaigns exploit the vulnerability of compromise to second guessing. Unlike legislation, which requires collaboration, political campaigns are zero-sum, winner-take-all battles. Campaigns reward an uncompromising mindset or a candidate's readiness to draw a stark contrast between her position and her opponent's, even when it means disparaging her adversary's motives, exaggerating the differences between them, and taking extreme attention-getting stands, such as no new taxes or no cuts in Social Security. Extreme stands that make flexibility and open-mindedness look wishy-washy by comparison. So in a campaign, short-term gains override the longer-term relationships that compromise depends on. Candidates in a campaign listen to their opponents, but not for overtures that they can reciprocate, but for weaknesses that they can exploit. Winning isn't everything in a political campaign, it's the only thing. Now, Gutman and Thompson argue that in American politics, for a variety of reasons, campaigning never stops. Congressional Republicans and senators are always looking back at the last election or ahead to the next one, at great cost to their ability to govern. Especially in gerrymandered House districts controlled by a single party, the next election means the next primary, when elected officials know they will be challenged by opponents who hold their achievements against them exactly because those legislative achievements required compromise. It's become a ritual for a candidate to challenge an incumbent in a primary by saying that, unlike the incumbent, I will never compromise. And when I was working on this summer, I came across a great example when Liz Cheney decided to challenge the incumbent senator in Wyoming. And Wyoming is a state where if you win the, in this case, Republican primary, you're pretty much guaranteed to win the election. It's not gerrymandered, but it's just how the makeup of the population. And the article describing her entrance to the race and her challenging this incumbent said, here's what it says. It says, she describes him sort of tacitly as too old. And so it says, but along with the generational swipe at the senator, Ms. Cheney implicitly took a shot at his low-key and consensus-oriented style, saying, quote, this is her word, "We can no longer afford to get along to go along," in declaring that Wyoming needed a strong voice in Washington. And she says, "I will never compromise when our freedom is at stake," said Ms. Cheney, a not-so-subtle preference to the senator's penchant for working with Democrats to find common ground. She subsequently dropped out of the race, by the way, but for other reasons. So here's the dilemma. In primaries, candidates can't win without staking out extreme positions and vowing never to compromise. In office, however, elected officials can't get anything done without being more flexible and thereby risking in the next election criticism for flip-flopping. Aided by rules like the filibuster, which give disproportionate power to minority voices, obstructing change turns out to be politically smarter and easier than making the concessions necessary to achieving change. Anticipating gridlock, legislators exchange proposals that have no chance of passing, but that play to the base that will be judging them in the next election. Hardliners measure proposed legislation, which again always involves compromise, not against the status quo, but against a dream that they refuse to give up. The dream of having it all without ever having to take into account the perspective of the other side. And that's the dream that campaigning encourages. Here's a milder example of this after-the-fact criticism of compromise that occurs all the time in political campaigns. Have you ever noticed that whenever a compromise is achieved, this is particularly true, I'll use my own home here in universities. Have you ever noticed that when a compromise is achieved, some people anyway, will look back at it and say, oh, it's okay, but it's a compromise. Or you can tell it came from a committee. Or my favorite expression is, I guess it's the best we can do, but if I were king, I would do such and such. And the way this usually works in universities, let's say your department has decided to require, I'm just making this up, 2 semesters of foreign language. And then the superior comment goes, well, if I were king, I would have required 4 semesters of 6 foreign languages and shown that we were really serious about international education. Well, I love that expression because it really reminds me why in a democracy we did away with kings. And here I think there's one other adage that comes into play. If you've ever heard the adage, which I think is very helpful, never let the perfect get the better of the good or the better. I think this is very valuable because often our concept of the perfect is our own personal fantasy of what perfection ought to be, against which we then measure the collaborative work of our colleagues. And a while ago, my wife and I are avid swimmers, and we love to go swim laps in the Trinity pool. And a while ago, there was a great article in the New York Times of a woman complaining about poor behavior in swimming pools, meaning people who will stand in a lane and talk while you want to get in and swim, or people who won't share a lane. And the title of her article was, "You're not the only one in the pool." And I think that if there's anything you take away from this as a sort of a reminder that I think we all need, is just we all need to tell ourselves every once in a while, you're not the only one in the pool. And that, I think, breeds appreciation what our colleagues are doing. Well, Thompson and Gutman propose many specific remedies for the legislative dilemma that I just described, in particular for limiting and reforming campaigning. But I want to focus on one more general comment that they make that they don't develop very much, which is that they say they think what we need is a new K through 12 civic education that would help young people learn how to engage constructively with people who disagree with them. Since they don't say much about it, I will. And one of my heroes for this kind of civic education would be one of the historical figures would be some people who have made a major difference in their societies, not by spurning their adversaries, but by respecting them. I would personally nominate Nelson Mandela for such a history. Robert Mnookin, who chairs the Harvard Law School program on negotiation, calls Mandela one of the best negotiators of the 20th century, not because he always won, but because he changed the conversation from winning and losing to collaboration. Mandela had every reason not to negotiate with the national ruling party of South Africa. 23 years of unjust imprisonment, pressure from his followers, his political base to retaliate and strike back even violently once he had a chance. Lack of any personal feeling whatsoever for F.W. de Klerk, the adversary he had to negotiate with. But Mandela's decision to bargain with his enemies and even compromise with them turned out to be more successful than violent resistance ever could have been. As Mnookin writes, quote, Mandela was a negotiator to whom one could make concessions and yet maintain one's self-respect. Mandela worked hard to establish and maintain a personal human connection with Afrikaner leaders whose lives and experiences and attitudes were radically different from his own. These leaders came to see that Mandela really believed in racial reconciliation. They saw that his vision of South Africa included them. Also in this education that I'm describing here, I also want to argue that literature and the other arts should play a central role. Again, this is the kind of education that would help young people learn how to compromise. Not too long ago, in the San Francisco Symphony was having a very bitter labor dispute. And one of the musicians was asked, well, why are you so stuck in this dispute? Why are you so meaning everybody, not just the musicians, why are you so gripped with retaliating and revenge and getting even, and you just can't seem to move forward? The musician said something that I think has stuck with me ever since. He said that the unwillingness to compromise was fueled by what he called the fear of empathizing, the fear of hearing somebody else's side, lest it make it harder for you to disagree with that person. And I think that literature and the other arts combat this fear of empathizing by exposing us to different points of view. Think here of Shakespeare and the astonishing range of characters and viewpoints he allows us to enter into. Reading and discussing literature slows us down, encourages us to choose our words more carefully, makes us more patient with complexity, helps us get outside ourselves and consider other points of view without always having to interject our own. Now, thinking about education takes me back to the Emory Magazine article that I started out with, and so I'll conclude by offering you my personal response to that article. Okay, I have to say, he chose a terrible example, in my opinion. It's one that gives compromise a bad name, and it links compromise to expediency, getting along at all costs, and cowardly giving up on our values. But the question comes up is, well, why do I think that's such a bad example? Aren't I engaging in the second guessing and piling on that I've been criticizing others for? More generally, how do I determine in any given instance when I should compromise and when I should hold my ground? Well, in answering this question, I like the test posed by a philosopher in a book called On Compromise and Rotten Compromises. And he says that the 3/5 compromise, in his opinion, is a rotten compromise. A rotten compromise, he says, secures peace, but at the expense of justice, which at the time of the Constitutional Convention demanded an end to slavery instead of allowing it to continue. One other example of a rotten compromise that he gives is the 1938 Munich Agreement with Hitler, which he says describes as a pact with the radical evil that culminated in the Holocaust. Now, he also thinks, as I do, that compromise is essential to democracy. And here's how he says compromise breathes life into democracy. And here's how I would put the value of compromise. Openness to compromise means readiness to share the world with people who differ from us. Not because we have to, but because we want to. We value compromise because we believe that we benefit from ongoing relationships that encourage disagreement, independence, and dissent. These beliefs are essential to the hope that democracies depend on. So it follows that rejecting a compromise should be a carefully arrived at last resort, not a knee-jerk reaction to disagreement. It should meet the strict test that this philosopher applies to the 3/5 compromise and the Munich Agreement. It should meet the test of whether or not the proposed compromise deepens man's inhumanity to man, whether it perpetuates injustice. Now, once a proposed compromise passes this strict moral test, then it's open to other kinds of tests, such as is it doable, is it cost, and so forth. So I would hope that if I succeed in this talk, we would, in the future, reject a proposal, not because it's once it passes this moral test, reject a proposal, not because it's a compromise, but because it's a bad compromise, to be replaced through continued discussion by a better compromise. Now, here's a final reason why defending compromise has become so difficult. It's our willingness to apply to all compromises, the forceful moral disapproval that Professor Marguerite, the professor I've been quoting, reserves for the 3/5 and Munich compromises. And here's a mild example of what I mean, taken from one of those NBA games that I always manage to stay awake for. In 1999, June 1999, New York Knicks player Larry Johnson was fined for the NBA for not doing something the league required him to do. And he defended his uncompromising non-compliance with this request. And he protested the fine by saying that he and his teammates were, quote, rebellious slaves, thereby likening the NBA to an oppressive plantation. Now, what Johnson had been asked to do was to give an interview after a playoff game to the announcer, Bill Walton, whom he didn't like because Walton had criticized his play. Now, Johnson at the time was under an $84 million contract with the New York Knicks, and a puzzled New York Times reporter asked how he could compare himself to a slave. To his credit, Johnson recognized the legitimacy of the question and tried to answer it, but many people listening remained skeptical of his answer. And so the New York Times reporter concluded, "Some wonder if Johnson's controversial ramblings this week are associated with his frustration over playing with an injury and struggling to guard Tim Duncan." I can't tell you how much I love that comment. And the analogy between NBA players and slaves never gained much traction, and many others disavowed it. Sadly, however, discussions of controversial political topics today, especially over the internet, continue to raid modern history for questionable historical analogies. It's common in these discussions for people to demonize the people they disagree with by invoking horrendous villains, such as Hitler and Stalin. It's also common for people to criticize the proposals they dislike by equating them to some of the worst atrocities in modern experience, including such as the Holocaust. As the rhetoric heats up, individuals lose perspective, blow things out of proportion, and end up rejecting all compromises as rotten. What's even worse, they limit themselves to exchanging their ideas only with people who disagree with, they limit themselves to exchanging their ideas only with people who already agree with them. And what happens is we get this sort of self-contained echo chamber in which individuals often egg one another on into taking even more extreme positions. It reminds me of what happens before a football game where you have teams on opposite sides of the field within each team yelling at one another and hitting each other on the shoulder pad and getting everybody just sort of like revved up for the combat, which is the football game. And I think that that's probably a valuable way to prepare for a winner-take-all competition like a football game. But it's not so good preparation for thoughtful collaboration and possibly compromise. Now, I understand that things can be said hastily in anger, distortions, insults, and so forth. But for me, that's a problem. That's not the inevitable outgrowth of disagreement. Despite much evidence to the contrary, I believe the discussions of controversial topics can be civil, respectful, and informed. These are the discussions that nurture the possibility of compromise and keep hope for compromise alive, not shouting matches. I also believe that universities can be places where conversations thrive. And here again, I agree with Dr. Martin of Emory. In fact, what Dr. Martin says about Emory University, I would say about Trinity. It's a university that welcomes different points of view and works through them to decisions that benefit the university as a whole. I would be disappointed if students graduated from Trinity without any convictions and we're cynically ready to take on whatever beliefs and values would get them ahead, like chameleons adapting to whatever situation they find themselves in. On the other hand, I'd also be disappointed if our students graduated and went on to experience every disagreement as a knockdown, drag-out fight that they had to win in order to protect their own convictions. Respect for other points of view is built into our liberal arts curriculum here at Trinity, which requires students to take courses in the sciences, social sciences, arts, and humanities, no matter what their major, and where these students learn why we need philosophers as well as physicists, artists as well as engineers, bankers as well as biologists. Small classes at Trinity enable robust discussions and help students learn that listening to someone else's argument matters as much as expressing your own point of view. Our small classes also allow us as professors to assign more writing, giving students the opportunity to slow down, choose their own words thoughtfully, and benefit from the feedback of their fellow students and their professors. Finally, our students at Trinity are required to live on campus for 3 years, where they are exposed every day to people of different backgrounds and different parts of the world, to students from 47 states and 67 foreign countries, to be exact, which I think is a remarkable introduction to the interdependent world our students will be graduating into. So I place a lot of hope in liberal arts education and in universities that encourage constructive discussion, that strengthen our capacity for empathy, and that reinforce our receptivity to compromise. I think we're at one of those universities right now, which is why I'm going to do now what all of our food for thought speakers do, which is finally to quit talking, to give you the chance to ask your questions and make your comments. And I'm hoping that maybe today, this invitation to turn what's been a monologue into a dialogue will remind us that we are all right now here in the Fiesta Room at a great university, and this is what we do. Thank you very much. That's your cue to ask questions. You know, I am dying to get a tweet question. I've never read a tweet in my life, so if anyone...
Not yet.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Fischer. I'm Michael Drudge, class of 1973. I'm one of your swimming mates. You might remember me from...
I do. Good to see you. And you behave yourself, too.
Yes, I tried to show you. I just wanted to make a comment really about your comments on the internet, and Facebook in particular, seem to generate a lot of threads of debate in my circle of friends. I have some who are zealot liberals and others who are big Tea Party fans. And a while back, a couple of weeks ago, one of the threads degenerated into where there were threats of filing libel lawsuits against each other. It got so heated. And so I wanted just to thank you for pointing out that particular aspect and how that, I think, it's kind of changed our society in a way, and that we can communicate and have these arguments across large distances. Yeah, so that's my comment.
Well, I appreciate that. And some analyses of these discussions emphasize the fact that they're disembodied and anonymous, thereby militating against the empathizing that I value. It is it's quite different. I think that okay. It's quite different to disagree with someone sitting across the table from you and somebody that you will then see the next day than anonymously engaged in discussions on the internet. I'm not doing anything, by the way, to make this happen. Could you please use the microphone since this is being recorded? Thank you. There's one back there. I don't think this one is working perfectly.
Hello there. Is it on?
Yeah, I think so.
Hello. Is it possible that the use of the 3/16 example was actually a perfect example because it's created a discussion that probably would never have taken place.
That's a great point. I don't think he intended it that way, but I think that is a great point. And the discussion has been very healthy, not only of that compromise, but of discussion of compromise in general. Any other questions? Jeannie, do you mind using the microphone? Or?
Michael, is there a way that you could get that book that you quoted so often into the hands of all of our legislators? Some more education there.
Thank you.
What is the name of Dr. Goodman's book again?
It's called The Spirit of Compromise. Her name is spelled Gutman, and Dennis Thompson, called The Spirit of Compromise, Why Governing Demands It and Campaigning Undermines It. And the other book I was referring to, the other two other books, one is called, it has to do with rotten compromises, and let's see if I can find it quickly. It's something on compromise. The author is Margalit, Magalit, and then the other book that I referred to by Robert Mnookin, who's the head of the Harvard Negotiation Project, it has the great title, Bargaining with the Devil, when we should, the subtitle, when we should negotiate with someone and when we should fight. And it's all about how to determine in any given situation when to consider a compromise. It's really, it's quite good. Yeah.
I have a tweeted question for you.
This has made my day. I think it depends on the question, I guess.
No, I think it's a pretty good one. Would a decreased emphasis on competitive athletics help increase our children's acceptance of compromise?
What a great question, and I'm going to turn that over to our soccer coach, Paul McGinley. You know, I don't think so, because I also think that competitive athletics demands teamwork, and teamwork requires collaboration and subordinating your individual interests to something else. Now, obviously those teams collide with other teams, but to get there, they really do have to work things out. And as Paul, who's our next speaker in Food for Thought, will tell you, you know, there's a lot of issues on teams as to who gets playing time, et cetera, and there's a lot of contests between the individual and the group, a lot of compromise involved, if not with the coach, because he never compromises, but if not with the coach, at least with yourself, as you have to resign to the fact that Coach McGinley, you know, doesn't think you're as good as you think you are. And so I feel that the teamwork aspect of sports is very, you know, very valuable. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks again very much. I enjoyed it.